You couldn't talk to him. But when he wasn't drunk, he gave you good advice about painting. But he was always drunk. He didn't even need to drink a lot. From time to time, he would sleep at my place on the floor of my studio at La Ruche. In the morning, we got him out. He went back into the cafe, had a few sips of wine, and he was already off again. He was already in his normal state, because being drunk was his normal state.
He wasn't an alcoholic at all. He drank sometimes, but only very little, if he was very depressed. But in fact, all the things people said about him, that he was an alcoholic, and the film they made, which I didn't want to see, because I've heard it all.
Lumia Tchaikovsky conheceu Modigliani em 1917 em casa do negociante de arte Zworowski. Era polaca. Modigliani pintou-a repetidas vezes, 12 ao todo. São dos retratos mais maravilhosos que ele fez. Muitos anos depois, ela escreveu as suas memórias e disse que ser pintada por ele era como ter a alma posta a nu. Modigliani estava fascinado com a sua beleza e as feições de Slava. Exagerando-as, como sempre fazia, captou a serenidade que a caracterizava, a força e, ao mesmo tempo, a fragilidade da sua figura. Como parecem estranhamente naturais as distorções sofridas pelo corpo dela quando o retrato é visto como um todo. Só quando nos aproximamos muito para ver melhor um pormenor é que nos apercebemos dessa absurda distorção. Na altura, muitos houve que se sentiram ultrajados com tais liberdades e outros que atribuíam esta visão da beleza aos efeitos da bebida, bebida que tantos testemunhos sublinharam como o de Léopold Lévy.
He was a terrible drinker. That's public knowledge.
Chose publique. Mais encore une fois,
But again, when Modigliani drinks, perhaps he doesn't drink in the same way as other people.
de la même façon qu'un autre.
Dans le fond, il avait la conscience d'avoir un destin
He knew his fate was precarious,
Je pense qu'il
and
avait
I think he
besoin
needed
de
to
se
take
doper
stimulants to find
pour
the
avoir
energy to
l'énergie
work.
de travailler.
Nada de novo nem de excepcional em um artista precisar de estimulantes para trabalhar. E talvez que hoje isso nos surpreenda e perturbe menos por estarmos alertados para o problema da droga do que perturbava os contemporâneos de Modigliani. Mais esclarecedora é a observação que o artista tinha consciência de que a sua vida seria curta. O tempo não estava do seu lado e ele sabia-o. Daí, porventura, a pressa com que trabalhava. E daí as drogas para tornarem mais intensa a sua percepção das coisas. Mas que drogas eram essas? Pelos padrões dos nossos dias, nada de assim tão terrível. Temos o testemunho do pintor Monza.
He used to drug himself with hashish, and I think it soon began to affect him. I saw him taking it.
Il a été très beau, un peu ravagé.
He was very handsome, slightly ravaged by what people, myself excluded, call his debauched lifestyle. He drank. There are drunkards who look good, but he was ravaged by drugs, and one of the worst, hashish, which is merciless.
Era assim que Modigliani se via uns meses antes de morrer. Mas a máquina de filmar viu de uma maneira muito diferente. O orgulhoso bibelo italiano, o homem que ria, fascinava as pessoas e as atraía, sobretudo as mulheres. Porque o foco da sua vida não eram as drogas, nem a bebida, nem mesmo a saúde deteriorada, mas as mulheres. O escultor Ossip Zadkine.
There was no man for whom women were more important than Modigliani. We are still here to tell the tale. Modigliani was one of us, and there were women. Women loved Modigliani because he was kind. He laughed boisterously. He painted their portraits. I also know his daughter, who has written a book about her father. She's very much like him, in fact.
Jean Modigliani mal conheceu o pai e cresceu com a sua lenda. E à medida que a fama dele aumentava, a fama póstuma, Também os quadros, dantes despachados por 10 francos, eram cada vez mais procurados, valorizados, valiosos. Retratos de gente que já conheceu em grande parte com quem falou sobre o pai. Quem era ele? Que espécie de homem? O que impressionou e impressiona todos nós ao olharmos para a obra de Modigliani é que nesses retratos não transparece a angústia do homem que os pintou. Neles nada vemos do bêbado, do toxicómano, do arruaceiro. Longe disso. O mundo dele é habitado por gente melancólica, talvez, mas desperta, viva, cheia de vida. Gente grave e pensativa, observada por um olhar grave e perspicaz. Apesar de pintar com grande rapidez, os quadros revelam algo da essência de quem pousava, porque ele a captava. Nada é simplesmente elegante, superficial, uma mera presença. Jean Modigliani falou com um amigo sobre o que descobriu.
I was 15 months when my father died.
Vous avez écrit sur votre père.
So, did writing this book about your father, Modigliani without the legend, require a great deal of research?
Yes, research among the survivors of that period, and a lot of work at the Bibliothèque Nationale, going through documents and books.
So you were like any other researcher?
Absolutely. Except perhaps that I have family papers relating to his Italian youth. But again, they are documents, not personal accounts. I was fascinated by the way legends grew up and the connection between the legend of a painter like Van Gogh and his real life. For Modigliani, it was harder in a way because for Van Gogh, there were letters. For Modigliani, there is almost nothing.
Mais cette légende, est-ce qu'elle existait aussi dans votre famille?
Did this legend exist in your family when you were a little girl?
On parlait déjà.
Was your father a legendary figure?
Comme d'un personnage de légende.
A little. It was a rather different legend, the kind that develops in a puritanical and very bourgeois family. Certain aspects of the character are glossed over, and others are emphasized. But I noticed that when it was a question of oral accounts, my family lied as much, if not more, than the art historians.
You just said lie, and indeed a legend is a lie, a holy lie sometimes. But what is the stuff of this legend? Perhaps that is where we should begin.
When I say lied, of course it wasn't intentional, but it is still lying. How did the legend grow? Which one? The family legend or the public? In my opinion, the public legend was created above all by the poets who moved in Montparnasse circles. Carco, for example, Andreuta, and the painters also made a major contribution. I think that it was perhaps the end of a certain conception of the artist.
So you think that this legend was created in a way to make Modigliani the hero, the one who paid for them?
Precisely. He lent himself to that role for a number of reasons. Firstly, he died, which is a major reason. There could only be affection and no rivalry. Nothing, no envy.
In a way, he courted death.
Possibly, there is that side. The man who ruined his own life. He was quite handsome, in a rather ordinary way when you know the Italians, but he was striking. He was not as crude, as uneducated and coarse as someone like Soutine, for example. There I almost agree with the Parisian legend, as opposed to my family's legend. It's true that he drank, that he took drugs, that he had some spectacular fits of drunkenness. It is also true that he drank himself to death. There isn't a shadow of doubt.
Why to death?
There again, you have to take common sense into account. For example, it isn't true that he began to drink in Paris. He already used to drink quite heavily in Venice and had begun to take drugs. Besides, when he arrived in Paris, he had already been ill. He had tuberculosis. In those days, you couldn't get rid of tuberculosis so easily. There is also the fact, which I think is very important, that he was of a nervous constitution and very fragile. He came from a family with a history of madness. or at least of depression. On top of that, Paris, the disorientation, a bit of poverty, a lot of alcohol and a lot of drugs obviously shattered that nervous balance, and he then carried on that way until it killed him. Perhaps he could have been cured. I don't know. We don't have his medical record.
Nenhum registros médicos. Tão pouca informação digna de confiança. Já Modigliani constatou que teria de recuar cada vez mais nas suas investigações. De que espécie de mundo provinha o pai? Como era aquela família judaico-italiana de Livorno? Negociantes respeitáveis, e sabia ela, da burguesia abastada, convencional. Mas estavam-lhe reservadas algumas surpresas. Com efeito, descobriu que quando Modigliani nasceu em 1884, não tinha um tostão.
The family was completely bankrupt. Modigliani's father wasn't a very good businessman. He went bankrupt, and it was an utter disaster. When my grandmother was in labor, the bailiffs came. And as the law in Italy prevents the distraint of anything that is on the bed of a woman in labor, they piled all their precious knickknacks on her stomach. It was my grandmother herself who told me the story. And so Modigliani was born into poverty, and a rather spectacular poverty at that.
He had come from Livorno, from his village. He was rich. He had just received 260 to 280,000 lire.
Perhaps he made that up.
It's not certain, just because Modigliani was always making things up. Firstly, when he went to Paris, he was given some money, as always when a beloved child goes abroad. He spent it all at once, saying he was rich. And what is more, until the end of his days, from time to time he would boast that he was the son of a banker, the great-grandson of a banker, that the blood of great financiers ran through his veins. It was a sort of ostentation, as though he were saying he was a descendant of Spinoza.
Have you researched his stay in Venice?
First of all, he went to Florence, to the Academy for a very short time, and then he went to Venice. I found his records at the Academy, which showed he was there for nearly 3 years. He left Venice to go to Paris, without returning to Livorno. What struck me was that already in Venice he was leading a life of debauchery. I spoke to painters who were with him at the time. He wasn't at the Academy. He drank and frequented the sleazy parts of Venice rather than going to his lessons.
To sum up, the family papers you found show a doting mother, a father who was away a lot, a Jewish family but not practicing, a rather intellectual family.
Yes, they weren't practicing Jews, but culturally they were a typical Mediterranean Jewish family. Because they had scattered all over the place, some of the family were in London, others in Tunis, and some more in Marseille. They spoke several languages, for a start, and had a broader vision of the world. As for his taste in literature, it was that of his day, and also that of his family. His grandmother translated D'Annunzio. Nietzsche was his young aunt's bedside book. As for Dante, in Paris they were astonished that he recited Dante, but all Italians do.
Modigliani veio para Paris em 1906. Tinha 22 anos. Não veio logo para Montparnasse. Nessa época, poucos eram os artistas que procuravam atelier a sul do Sena. O lugar dos artistas era Montmartre. Aqui viviam Picasso, Braque e muitos outros. Era um Montmartre ainda rústico, uma vila de província. Muitos anos depois, alguém conheceu o Montmartre rústico e Modigliani também, voltou lá com um amigo pintor. Era um lugar cheio de recordações. Esta rua conhecia o trilho muito bem, pois pintou-a várias vezes. E foi aqui que, em Paris, tudo começou para Modigliani. O visitante que regressa aos lugares assombrados do passado é Blaise Cendrasse.
Nous avons bien ri ensemble.
We had a lot of laughs
Et je l'ai
together.
perdu de vue quand son fric a été...
And I lost him when he squandered all his money. And he went to live like a pauper at the Bateau Lavoir.
O chamado Bateau Lavoir, ou Barcaça Lavadora em Montmartre, era uma comuna barata destinada a artistas pobres. Só lá havia sótãos e caves e estava a cair aos bocados. Picasso acabava de chegar de Espanha e era lá que vivia. Van Dongen também, e muitos outros. Ficavam lá até terem dinheiro para arranjar outro sítio. Quanto a Modigliani, ficou pouco tempo. Um dia embebedou-se e deu cabo dos quadros dos amigos, ou pelo menos é o que a lenda conta. O Bateau Lavoir original há muito que foi abaixo. Estava praticamente vazio quando Blaise Cendrasse lá voltou em busca de fantasmas e recordações. Mas ainda lá estava um fantasma que conheceu bem o sítio e Modigliani, o pintor italiano Gino Severini.
One morning, I was going up towards the Moulin de la Galette in the Rue Le Pic, and I met a gentleman like myself. He was about my height, similarly dressed. We looked at each other, then we walked past each other, and then we turned round. When we saw that we really were dressed in the same way, we turned round again and said, "You must be Italian." He said, "Yes, I'm from Livorno." And I said, "I'm from Cortompadaris." And that was how we got talking. "What do you do?" "I'm a painter." "So am I." And that was the beginning of our friendship, because we saw that we had a lot in common. Besides, when you're young, you don't have a clear goal. Why were we